Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 21 of Book 2 of the Royal Ranger series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. The 8 archers broke ranks and ran for the riverbank, where horsemen were waiting to help them across the ford. Handing their bows up to the riders to keep them clear of the river, they seized hold of the horses' harnesses, grabbing stirrup leathers or girth straps. Some of the horses had leather harnesses around their necks as well, and these made excellent handholds. The riders waited until their passengers were settled, then urged their horses forward at a walk into the river. Seeing that his men had started crossing, Gillen paced backward to the riverbank, keeping a keen eye on the foxes. As he had expected, their discipline and their willingness to fight had evaporated. They skulked among the trees, seeking protection from the deadly arrows, even though they were well out of range. Their commander, his left arm in a sling and a blood-stained bandage around his shoulder, railed at them in vain, challenging their courage, threatening to withhold their pay and have every fifth man whipped. They avoided his furious gaze, turning away and sinking to the long grass, physically and mentally exhausted by the ordeal they had just gone through. Reflecting the opinion of the sergeant, who had led them back to safety, they occasionally cast angry glances at their shouting commander. "It's fine for you to shout and threaten," they thought. "You stayed safe here in the trees while we were providing target practice for those cursed archers." A leader who refused to share the discomforts of campaigning and the risk of combat with his men rapidly lost their respect and their willingness to obey his orders. But their commander was too obtuse to realize that. He thought bluster and threats could take the place of respect. Eventually, by dint of threatening and punishing those who disobeyed, discipline would be restored among the foxes, to a certain extent. But it would take time, and in that time, the enemy were escaping across the ford. Gillen waited on the southern bank, keeping a keen watch on the enemy force, until the second group of archers were almost across the river. Then, seeing no sign that the foxes had rallied, he turned Blaze's head and urged the mare into the river. She pushed strongly, half walking, half swimming. She wasn't as long in the leg as the taller cavalry horses, and the water came up almost to the saddle. But Gillen was an expert rider, and he maintained his balance against Blaze's lunging progress, staying in the saddle as the horse forced her way across the ford. Then he felt the water level dropping away as the river shallowed. Blaze's gait steadied, and she trotted up the bank, pausing to shake herself, sending a shower of water that gleamed silver in the sunlight. Horace, who had been waiting for Gillen, took the brunt of it. "Thank you very much," he said sarcastically, wiping river water from his face. Gillen grinned easily at him. "If you don't know that's the first thing a horse does after it's been swimming, don't blame me." Horace shielded his eyes with one hand and peered back across the river. "No sign of movement there?" Gillen stood in his stirrups and followed the tall warrior's gaze. "It'll be a while before they get them moving again," he said. "They've taken 2 drubbings from our archers, and they won't be keen for a third." "Of course, things might change once they see we've moved out," Horace said. Gillen considered the statement. "You think they'll keep after us, then?" Horace nodded. "Don't see why they wouldn't. They lured us here for a purpose, and so far, they haven't accomplished it." Gillen scanned the ground around them. The terrain here was similar to the side they had just left, with relatively open ground for 100 meters or so, then thick trees. 40 meters from the river, he saw a line of low bushes, 15 meters long and about chest high. That would provide concealment for a small group of men. "I'll keep 4 men here, under cover," he said, indicating the bushes. "Once the foxes get their nerve up and try to cross, we'll do what we can to change their minds." "And what happens when you leave?" Horace asked. Gillen shrugged. "With any luck, they won't know that we've gone. I'll get the men to fall back one at a time, staying low until they reach the trees. If you leave some on horses tethered here for us, we should get a head start on them." Horace considered the plan. That should work, he said. Without horses, they're going to have to try to get ropes across the river so that their main body can cross. So the first men to cross will have to swim, carrying the ropes. And they should be easy targets, Gillen agreed. If we pick off 3 or 4 of them, the rest will be reluctant to try crossing. By the time they realize we're gone, we should have a good lead. I assume you'll be the last to leave? Horace said. Gillen met his gaze evenly. Of course, he said. I'm not going to ask someone else to stay behind. Besides, I'm the best shot, so it makes sense for me to stay till the end. Just checking, Horace said mildly. In Gillen's place, he would have done the same. Besides, as the ranger said, it made sense for the best shot to be the last to leave. You'd better get moving, Gillen told him now, in a brisker tone. He gestured toward the far bank, and the small figures moving among the trees. They won't stay moping around there forever. He dismounted and strode quickly to where the archers were waiting. Most of them had stripped off their soaked outer clothing and were working in pairs to wring the water out. They looked up as he approached. All right, get dressed and move out. Find the horses you were riding and mount up. Nestor, Cleet, Gilbert, and Walt, you stay with me. Have you all got full quivers? 2 of the men nodded. The others indicated their quivers. One had 3 shafts left. The other had 5. Right. Collect more from the supply wagon. In fact, get extra for the rest of the men. On the double, he snapped. And the 2 archers trotted off to the supply wagon, where 2,000 spare shafts were stored in arrow bags. A few minutes later, Horace led the force into the tree line and turned to the west. Horses for the 4 archers who would remain with Gillen were tethered in the trees, out of sight of the far bank. Horace led Blaze into the trees and let the reins fall to the ground once they were in the shadows. The ranger horse would wait there until Gillen came for her. Staying low to avoid being seen, he then returned to the line of bushes, where the others were waiting. They crouched in the cover of the bushes, while he outlined the plan. Stay out of sight, he told them. We don't want them to know we're here until we start shooting. Then, one by one, make your way to the trees and follow the main party. Try to stay out of sight. I want the enemy to think we're still here, even after we're long gone. The 4 men nodded. They grinned at one another. They were enjoying this fight. Usually, a battle meant they stayed in a line and shot shaft after shaft into the air in a solid hail of arrows. It was fairly impersonal, and most of the time they couldn't really see the effect their shooting was having. This encounter was different. They had seen their shafts taking down the men who were advancing on them, seen the havoc and uncertainty their shooting caused, and so far they had been untouched themselves. Might as well make yourselves comfortable while we're waiting, Gillen told them. I'll keep an eye on our friends across the river. They settled down on the soft grass. Like all soldiers, they were experienced in taking any opportunity to rest. In the space of a few minutes, 2 of them were even snoring gently, their heads resting on their packs. Gillen looked at them and smiled. Nestor, the oldest of the group, saw the look. They'll sleep anywhere, he said, grinning. If they'd stopped halfway across the river, they probably would have dozed off there. The sun was warm on their backs, and their clothes were quickly drying. Not that they'd be completely dry, of course, but they were no longer heavy and sodden. Gillen pulled his cowl up to put the pale oval of his face in shadow, and crouched behind the line of bushes, finding a gap through which he could watch the far bank. A mayfly buzzed around his head. He was tempted to swipe at it, but resisted the urge. The movement might be seen by the enemy. Instead, as it hovered close to his face, he screwed his lips up and tried to blow it away. The mayfly ignored the attempt. Time passed, and the faint noises of Horace's group, the jingle of harness, rattle of weapons, and thudding of hoofs on soft grass, gradually died away. The mayfly became more persistent, and in spite of himself, Gillen found his eyelids drooping heavily. He shook his head and changed his position into a less comfortable one, kneeling on one knee. Cleet and Walt continued to snore softly. He saw movement across the river and came more upright, looking closely, although remaining concealed behind the bushes. A dozen or so men were advancing from the tree line, heading for the riverbank. They moved cautiously, expecting any minute to be assailed by a hail of arrows. As this didn't happen, they became more confident. Initially moving in a crouch, they stood and began to move faster. Gillen, from his hiding place, could see that 3 of them had heavy coils of rope around their shoulders. He nodded to Nestor, indicating the 2 sleeping men. The old archer reached behind him and shook the 2 men gently. Experienced warriors that they were, they came awake without any undue noise, instantly ready for action. "They're coming," Gillen whispered. "Get ready." The 4 archers slowly changed position until they were kneeling on one knee behind the covering bushes. They had each slipped an arrow from their quivers and had them ready on the bowstrings. They looked expectantly at the ranger, now half concealed in the bushes, where he had moved forward for a better view. "Not yet," he said softly. The 3 men carrying the ropes had reached the river's edge. They shrugged the rope coils off their shoulders and began to attach the loose ends to anchor points on the bank, sturdy saplings or deeply embedded rocks. They stripped down to their undergarments and tied the ropes around their waists. "They're going to swim the ropes across," Gillen whispered. "We'll wait till they're halfway across and start shooting." Watched by their comrades, who were crouched behind their shields on the bank, the 3 rope carriers waded into the river. One of them cried out in surprise as he felt the unexpected strength of the current. Then he recovered and continued to wade out. Within a few meters, they were shoulder deep in the water and forced to begin swimming. As soon as their feet left the bottom, they began to drift quickly downstream. But they were all strong swimmers, and Gillen could see they were making good progress across the ford. He selected the first man who had entered the water. He was obviously the strongest swimmer of the 3, and had gained a lead of several meters on the others. "I'll take the nearest one," Gillen said, rising slowly to his feet. "You take care of the others." His 4 archers also rose, their heads and shoulders now above the screening bushes. But they went unnoticed. Understandably, the men on the far bank were watching the swimmers, slowly paying out the rope behind them as they fought their way across the river. The fact that they had been unmolested so far had given them a false sense of confidence. Gillen brought up his bow and sighted on the leading swimmer. Beside him, he sensed the other shooters were doing the same. "Now," he said softly, and released. All right, that is going to be the end of Chapter 21. Thank you all for joining me. I'll see you guys next time in Chapter 22. God bless, and have a good one.